All right. It's, oh, wow, that's loud, isn't it? It's 9:40, so we should get started, but I don't want to interrupt people getting their coffee. Um, Good morning. How about this? The Lord be with you. Thank you. Glenn is right. That works every time. Better than clinking a glass, which I don't have. Thank you so much for coming out this morning. That's a really interesting person we're going to be looking at today. And I was just talking about how you could spend the whole time just talking about Bonhoeffer himself and the times in which he lived. We won't do that, but we'll talk a bit about that. Just a note for where we're going from here. I won't be in quorum because there are other things going on in this room for the next several weeks after this, and then we'll pick up again in April with this same theme. We'll do Howard Thurman and then Martin Luther King Jr. And then at the end of April, we start our series on religious freedom and civic freedom in the colonies and the revolutionary period. So, which would be really interesting. Pardon me?
So are you talking mid-April? Can you give us the date?
Yeah, hold on.
Calendar.
All right, I'll give you the exact date if I can find it. Oh, here we go. We will start again on April 12th.
Perfect, thank you.
And then April 19th, we'll do Martin Luther King Jr. And April 26th, we'll do the Cambridge Platform and Roger Williams. So we'll start the American. And Roger Williams is one of the most interesting theologians ever. Just an utterly unique person. So I'm looking forward to that. And a lot of the themes that show up in that discussion will be themes that come out of this, especially the theme of religious persecution. Trying to overcome that is a major movement in American history. So it'll be interesting to see that. But I won't be here. We won't be doing like this kind of forum for several weeks. So that also Easter's coming up. That all makes sense, right? Okay, so we're doing Dietrich Bonhoeffer today. We did Dirk Willems last week, and so we're jumping several hundred years. We'll spend the rest of the time in the 20th century. So Bonhoeffer's life is very, very interesting. He's a German Lutheran theologian. He was born in 1906, and then he was hung in 1945. And so very, very young. You would never guess that he was only 39 years old, but he's one of those people like Mozart or Søren Kierkegaard, whose life just explodes on the world scene, has a continuing effect, even though they died young. He was raised in a university family, the University of Berlin. His father was a professor of psychology there. And so he was very much part of the academic world in Germany, which is a very, if you know German culture, very high-flown academic world there. And at the age of 14, he decided, I will become a theologian. I just think that's, and he did it. That's the amazing thing. I was going to be all sorts of things when I was 14. I don't think I did any of those. And so he did the kind of classic training. He wrote his first dissertation on the communion of saints and was a pastor of a German congregation in Barcelona, Spain. There's another thing about him. He had a lot of international contacts. And then he was assistant professor of systematic theology at Berlin University, which is not surprising. And then he wrote his second dissertation called Act and Being. And you can see from that he had a very philosophical inclination in his theological work, which is very typical for theology of this time. And then he was invited to come for a year to Union Theological Seminary in New York to study, and that was in 1930. So he spent a year in New York City, and and he'd already written both of his dissertations for being certified for a PhD. In Germany, you have to write 2 dissertations; you don't just write one. So I was a lightweight anyway. But then he came over to the United States and lived at Union. And as you know, Union's in Harlem, basically. And this was a total revelation for him to live in Harlem. And he was immediately interested in not only the Jewish community, because Reinhold Niebuhr was there and became a very good friend of his, but also Abraham Joshua Heschel was there. And so his interest in Jewish Christian contacts was very strong, but especially the African-American community in Harlem. And he had Black students in his classes at Union who invited him to come to church with them at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, which was a very well-known preaching center, and it just blew him away. And this whole experience changed his life. So he was aware first of all, that there are people in this country suffering racial injustice and struggling against it as Christians. So the Black church experience of slavery and the recovery from slavery and the attempt to overcome racism really struck him. He said, there's nothing like that in Germany. The centrality of the Bible struck him. The Black church is very much based on, as you know, biblical preaching, right? Very powerful biblical preaching. And he was very interested in philosophy. And so it's like, oh, the Bible's really interesting. So from that point on, he did daily devotions based on scripture. And some of them have been published. Actually, he wrote a series of devotions on the Psalms, which are really quite beautiful. The other thing that he developed at this time is solidarity with the oppressed. And this becomes one of the major themes by which he's known. He was one of the people who really started to turn theology toward keeping your eye out for those who are suffering oppression and those who are being marginalized, et cetera, which meant when he got back to Germany, the Jews, how the Jews were being treated was going to be a huge issue for him. Didn't know right away. It was a growing issue for him. And then finally, he develops this insight, and he was a very devout Lutheran, very faithful to the Lutheran confessions. But he became aware through his experience in the Black church that he basically believed in what he came to call cheap grace. And cheap grace is, of course, we're sinners. God forgives us anyway. And, it would be nice if we changed our lives, but, I've got a lot on my plate, but God forgives me anyway. And my life looks just like a regular old bourgeois citizen of wherever I live, but I obey all the laws. I don't even speed, and so I'm a good Christian. Right? And I'm forgiven. God loves me. And so he came to see this is actually possibly what Luther was actually teaching, or possibly a perversion of what Luther was teaching. But he comes to contrast cheap grace with costly grace. And so that's a problem for him from this point on. And when he got back to Germany after this year, his friends immediately noticed that he was different. And they said, what happened? And he said, I became a Christian. And that's so cool. John Wesley undergoes a similar thing, actually. And the problem that he sets for himself leads to the writing in 1937 of what's called the cost of discipleship. He just called it Nachfolge, which means following, or just, because a disciple follows in the footsteps. But he says in this book, he says, to put it quite simply, we must undertake this task, which he's doing in this book, because we are now ready to admit that we no longer stand in the path of true discipleship. That's an astonishing claim. We confess that although our church is orthodox as far as her doctrine of grace is concerned, we are no longer sure that we are members of a church which follows its Lord. We must therefore attempt to recover a true understanding of the mutual relation between grace and discipleship. The issue can no longer be evaded. It is becoming clearer every day that the most urgent problem besetting our church is this: how can we live the Christian life in the modern world? And he goes on to say, happy are they who know that discipleship simply means the life which springs from grace, and that grace simply means discipleship. So it's very interesting and this is a problem he worked on for the rest of his life, that how do you integrate grace and works, faith and works? How do you integrate nature and grace, all of these things? How do you integrate the Christian life and life in the world? That was a major issue for him. But I just think that's fascinating that all those questions came up from his experience at Union in New York. Well, he went back to Germany, and shortly after he gets back, of course, Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933. And so one way in which Bonhoeffer is known is not only the cost of discipleship, but also his involvement in resistance to Hitler's Nazi regime. And he has two phases of that. The first phase was pastoral and theological. He and others start what they call the confessing church, because the state church in Germany was very interested. By the way, Hitler hated Christians of all stripes, but the German Christians, as they came to call themselves, were very interested in courting Hitler's favor. So they were changing their theology very much to fit the Third Reich and Nazi ideology. And so Bonhoeffer and others, Karl Barth among them, Bultmann among others, decided they couldn't participate in this at all. So they start what they call the confessing church. And so Bonhoeffer became very much a part of the confessing church. They opened their own seminary to train pastors outside of this German Christian ideology. And so for several years, the confessing church was his way of trying to resist the Nazi regime. And they tried to keep off the radar as much as possible. But after a few years, the Gestapo closes their school, their seminary. He continued to teach, but he had to teach outside of any kind of institution. The next phase, though, is, people could tell where the Nazi regime was going pretty early on. And so he was invited to come back to New York by Reinhold Niebuhr, who's a friend of his, to give a series of lectures, right? But it was basically to get him out of there. And so he got out. And while he's out, and he could have stayed here the rest of his life. Paul Tillich did. He had a very successful career when he left. But he began to realize, and he said this actually, I can't help in the reconstruction of Germany unless I suffer with my people now. Right? I can't just go back when it's convenient. Unless I live through the trial, I won't have any credibility, and I don't want to. I don't want to leave my people in their hour of need. So he went back. And he knew what the likely outcome of that would be. But that's really remarkable. He had every opportunity to stay out. Karl Barth left, wound up in Basel, never went back. Paul Tillich left, came over here, never went back. Bonhoeffer went back. And shortly after that, in 1939, he was invited to become part of an officers' corps of intelligence officers who were actually resisting Hitler. So within the Nazi army itself, there were people in the military, there were generals who were very interested in leading to the defeat of Germany. And he said, it's very ironic that I'm working to lead to the defeat of my own country. But they were especially interested in trying to reach out to the Allies to try to negotiate a surrender. But they realized that the Allies were only interested in unconditional surrender. And so they knew that wasn't going to work. The officers' corps develops further when they realized that's not going to work, a plot to assassinate Hitler. And so, but they also used this officers group as a way of smuggling Jews out of Germany. And so Bonhoeffer was very much involved in the plan to smuggle Jews, especially to Switzerland, and they would say they were part of their corps. It was very clever, actually. So he was arrested because they smoked that out. The money, they're like, how are you spending this money? And they said, well, our expenses ran. And so they figured there was something wrong there, but that was not punishable by death. So he was arrested and imprisoned. And then they discovered the papers of the plot to assassinate Hitler. And so then he was sentenced with death. And so he was moved several times in the 1944-45 to different prisons and concentration camps. And then finally, 2 days before the camp in which he was housed was liberated by the Allies, he was hung with several other people as part of that plot. And Hitler sent out explicit instructions that they be killed before the Allies came. In fact, they had the killing machine was just going on overdrive during those last days of the Nazi regime. Also, the attempt to disguise all of the concentration camps. So he's a very complicated guy, because here he is writing about the Sermon on the Mount, while at the same time he had very pacifist leanings. He was not a pacifist, though. And at the same time, he was willing to put his life on the line to assassinate Hitler. He said, it's not enough. It's a great image. It's not enough to clean up the mess left by a drunk driver driving through a crowd. You have to take out the driver, right? It's not enough. So if the ruler is completely out of control and causing just utter destruction, don't just clean up the mess that's made. Take out the ruler. He thought that was rare, but he thought he had a command of God to do that. So it's very interesting that way. But the period we're looking at, he wrote The Cost of Discipleship, or what he just called discipleship, in 1937. So this is when he's still part of the confessing church. But it very clearly, as I indicated in that quote, belongs to that period after his experience in Harlem. So it's when he became a Christian. And he's trying to work out, if you're justified by faith, where does discipleship fit in? If you're saved by grace, then where does your life fit in? What difference does it make what your life looks like? And so he's trying to hold those two things together. And he has a very pointed way of putting it at one point. And it's a sentence for which he became the most famous in many ways. He says, because he's talking about discipleship as following the crucified one. It's not just following Jesus, it's following the one who's going to be crucified, which means you're going to be crucified. And so he says, the cross is laid on every Christian. The first Christ suffering which every person must experience is the call to abandon the attachments of this world. It is that dying of the old person which is the result of his encounter with Christ. As we embark upon discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. We give our lives over to death. Thus it begins. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls someone, he bids them come and die, which is true. Actually, if you read, especially the encounter between Jesus and Peter, if anyone would save their life, they must lose it. And anyone who loses his life for my sake will find it. So he thought that was a way of getting our attention and also getting our focus on discipleship is suffering with the suffering Christ, right? Which also means you look out for those who are suffering yourself. So this then brings us to his discussion in this book of the Sermon on the Mount, and it is unusual. I mean, this is the strange thing. If you look at Anabaptist theology, the Sermon on the, and spirituality, the Sermon on the Mount dominates. If you look at Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican, Roman Catholic, etc., not so much, right? And so the Anabaptist tradition has a lock on the Sermon on the Mount. He did not like the Anabaptist tradition per se, not because of that, but because they separated themselves from the world. And he thought that Jesus was actually calling us to live the Sermon on the Mount in the world, which is really hard to do, right? But he wants us to live that in the world. But on the other hand, he admired the Anabaptist tradition for their focus on discipleship, which he did not see in his own Lutheran setting. So this then brings us to the reading in the handout. And this is, of course, his comment on love your enemies, right? You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies, right? And pray for those who persecute you, bless those who curse you. I had never thought of this before when he says this. This is the point in the Sermon on the Mount, he says in the very top paragraph, where we encounter for the first time the word which summarizes everything in it, love. Now, it's not the first time the word love shows up in the Gospel of Matthew. This is my beloved son is the first time that it shows up, but that's directed at Jesus. But the first time Jesus teaches about love, this is true, is in this section, right? Immediately is put into clear-cut context of love, in the clear-cut context of love for our enemies. That's not usually, Valentine's Day isn't, I love you, my enemy. Let me send you flowers. We'll talk about that actually. But so Jesus is really challenging us rather dramatically here. Loving one's kindred is a commandment that could be misunderstood. Actually, later on in Matthew, he tells us, unless you hate your mother and father and family, you can't be my disciple. Or if you love them more than me, you can't be my disciple. So he could have brought that in, but he didn't. He says, loving enemies makes unmistakably clear what Jesus intends. And he gets to this later, but I think it'd be worth looking at this now. If you flip the page, and look at the second to the last paragraph there, which begins, what is undivided love? This is building on what Jesus, it's so interesting that Jesus does this. And as I said, I have to hand it to Bonhoeffer to point this out. The first time Jesus talks about loving others is loving enemies. It's not loving your friends. It's not loving your parents. It's not being a good son or daughter. It's not being a devoted citizen, etc. It's loving your enemies. I think that's incredible. You could just spend the rest of the time thinking about that. Why is the first time Jesus talks about it that? So he says, what is undivided love? Love which does not show special favor to those who return our love with their own. In which case I'm in big trouble, right? So in loving those who love us, our kindred, our people, our friends, yes, even our own Christian community, we are no different than the Gentiles and the tax collectors. That kind of love is self-evident, regular, natural, and not distinctly Christian. That's, I think, a remarkable statement. Everyone in the world knows how to love this way. Everyone in the world pretty much does love this way. Being a Christian doesn't make you a better father or better mother or a better sister or brother or a better citizen even. That's not what love is, according to Jesus. And he says right down at the very end, he says Jesus does not have a lot to say about that kind of love, because from Bonhoeffer's point of view, it's automatic. Everybody knows that, right? He says that goes without saying, but by simply acknowledging that, like the love of the neighbor the way we usually understanding it, and not wasting any further words on it, and in contrast to all that, commanding only love for enemies, he shows what he means by love and what they are to think about that other sort of love. So it's a really interesting point. There was a lot of work done on this issue, by the way. What did Jesus mean by love? Kierkegaard wrote a very influential book, which I know he knew, called Works of Love, in which he takes up this issue as well. What the world calls love is simply an alliance in self-love, Kierkegaard says. Anders Nygren, a Scandinavian theologian, wrote a book called Agape and Eros, which takes up this issue as well. So Bonhoeffer is part of this discussion, trying to figure out what's the difference between love as Jesus understood it and love the way we usually mean it. And I think he has the best answer right here. The first time Jesus talks about love, it's love your enemies, right? So I think that's worth the price of admission right there, I think. And then he points out, going back to the first page, the second paragraph, enemy, and this often isn't pointed out as well either. Howard Thurman will point this out in April. He says, enemy was no empty concept for the disciples. They knew it well. They met enemies daily. There were those who cursed them as destroyers of the faith and lawbreakers. There were those who hated them because they had left everything for Jesus' sake, and it might even include their parents, right? And who did not highly value anything but communion with him. There were those who insulted and scorned them for their weakness and humility. There were those who persecuted them, who feared a growing revolutionary danger in the group of disciples and were intent on destroying them. So enemies are generated by discipleship. Right? If you follow Jesus, you'll have enemies because you follow Jesus. I think he's also right about that. We usually take this as a general statement, love your enemies because everybody has them. Well, that's true. And he'll talk about that also, political as well as religious. But he's especially talking about the enmity that a life of discipleship generates, which is the way it challenges the way other people are living. Which means if you don't live differently than the way everyone around you is living, you're going to have no enmity. Everyone's going to love you. You're going to fit right in. But if you actually do what Jesus tells you to do, people are going to start hating you, beginning, Jesus points out, with your own family. I have come not to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set mother against daughter, father against son, etc., right? And the enemies of your own enemies will be members of your own household. So Bonhoeffer's not wrong about that. And then he points out, of course, loving one's enemies is not only an unbearable offense to the natural person, it demands more than the strength that a natural person can muster. And it offends the natural concept of good and evil. It does. It's offensive. It is offensive, right? To think about loving and think about where he is. He's in Nazi Germany. So who's he thinking about? The Nazis, of course he is, right? And they're very clearly starting to persecute his community of the confessing Christians, right? He wasn't killed because he was part of the confessing church, but he was killed because he was part of the resistance, right? But part of the resistance, central to resistance, if you will, is love. Love for whom? Your enemies, right? So it's very personal to him, but I think it's interesting that he's framing it in the Sermon on the Mount and in the context in which the disciples find themselves. We'll see Howard Thurman does exactly the same thing, because when you focus more on that, then you can see the applicability now. But if you skip that, you miss the applicability now, right? But even more important, loving one's enemies appears to people living according to the law to be a sin against God's law itself. And I have talked about that in the Jewish community, they don't ever teach hate your enemies, but they don't ever teach love your enemies. They think that's crazy. That's idealistic and unrealistic and dangerous. And so he's not wrong there, and they're not alone in thinking that. So against God's law itself would be sort of everyone's understanding of God's law. Separation from enemies and condemning them is what the law demands, or at least what it seems to demand. But Jesus takes God's law into his hands and interprets it to overcome enemies by loving them. That is God's will, which is contained in the law. Okay, so he actually goes back to Calvin's point, which is Jesus is interpreting the law, love your neighbor and don't have hatred in your heart, in a way that overcomes our natural way of reading that, which I think it is, that we'll love our neighbor who loves us. And then with everyone else, all bets are off, right? We can very easily hate them. That's not a problem. And then the other thing he points out, which had never occurred to me before, is the next paragraph. He says, in the New Testament, the enemy is always the one who hates me. Jesus does not even consider the possibility that there could be someone whom the disciple hates. Isn't that interesting? So it's the hatred is coming from outside to the disciple. It's not, you should stop hating people. Jesus can't even imagine them hating anyone, right? So that's a real indictment as well, to me anyway. And then he points out enemies should receive what sisters and brothers receive. In other words, members of their own community, namely love from Jesus's followers. The actions of disciples should not be determined by the human actions they encounter, but by Jesus acting in them. And this is his main point. When Jesus acts in you, Jesus acts by grace, this is what it looks like. So if it doesn't look like this, don't talk about grace. Don't talk about Christ living in me. Don't talk about I have the mind of Christ. This is what it looks like. That's what he's trying to get at, right? But on the other hand, because Christ lives in me, I can do this. Otherwise, I could never do it. Right? This is impossible for me. So if you look at this as an ethical mandate just to the natural person, Bonhoeffer's like, you'll never do it. That's why only those who are in the slipstream behind Jesus, only those flying in the V right behind the lead goose, which is Jesus, only they can do it because his influence moves through them and allows them to do it when they follow him. But that influence isn't going to be there if you're not following him. Right? So the condition of faith is following, and the possibility of actually following is faith. You see what I mean? But if you want grace and not discipleship, forget it. But if you want discipleship and not grace, forget it, because you can't do it. Right? So it's a very interesting, what he's trying to do then is create a perpetual generator here of discipleship and grace. Yes?
Is Bonhoeffer actually loving his enemies, other than talking about it? Do you have any?
Not that I looked at his little. Yeah, it's a really good question. So we don't have a Dirk Willems kind of incident here. I looked at his letters and papers from prison, and what struck people who were in prison with him, by the way, it's an amazing thing. These were all papers that were smuggled out of prison when Bonhoeffer was in prison the last couple of years of his life. And it was the character of his life that said the most, right? So he doesn't have a dramatic moment where he rescues a Gestapo agent who was chasing him or something like that. But he did have this influence on people around him, including right before he was hung, right? He said to a friend of his, he was very good friends with Bishop Bell in Chichester, England. And he was one of his main channels trying to get the resistance word out to the larger world. And he said to tell Bishop Bell, my life is just beginning. And then he stepped on the scaffold and was hung. And so, but the way he treated his fellow prisoners and the guards was very equanimity. It had a lot of equanimity to it and a lot of anxiety absorption, although he himself inside was not without anxiety and without all sorts of things. But he did out of love for the people around him, including the guards, he never manifested that. So in this instance, and everyone who knew him says this, right? There's no one who said, this guy's a real jerk, right? And yeah, he talks a good game, but he doesn't live a good game. On the other hand, does anyone live this perfectly other than Jesus? No, absolutely not. That's why we need him, right? We need to be forgiven when our attempts to follow him fall short. But we don't need him when we're not even bothering, right? That's cheap grace. I just live the life everyone else lives. I don't think for a minute about any of this, and I'm forgiven. So I'm forgiven for not being a disciple. That's really amazing, actually. Yeah, Paul.
Reconcile his belief in loving our enemies with his desire to kill Hitler.
Well, I'm not sure I would put it desire to kill Hitler because that makes it sound more personal, but with the plot to assassinate Hitler, yeah, for sure. Yeah, that is what happens when the disciple is placed in the world. So he did not, and Reinhold Niebuhr is very similar this way. They're not pacifists. They certainly understand that the default mode of a Christian is pacifism, right? Nonviolence. But both Niebuhr and Bonhoeffer thought straight up pacifism as a creed is wrong. Christianity is not pacifist, right? There are times in which you need to act in such a way, and he thought that God had commanded him to act in that way in Germany, and he knew it was exceptional, right? And of course, everyone can find, oh, I'm supposed to kill so and so, and I have this exceptional command of God. I just received it. So it's a very interesting and possibly problematic claim. Karl Barth has a whole discussion about exceptions to the divine command. But for Bonhoeffer, this was how he understood it. And it's because if you see, and Hitler was definitely driving the chariot that was mowing everyone down. If you see a madman driving a chariot, running people over, it's not enough just to pick the bodies up after them. You owe it. It's actually a work of love, believe it or not, to kill them. But it's not, that doesn't mean killing people is a work of love. But in this instance, it's not murder, right? And he also thought that the Christians needed to read the Hebrew Bible more, because what they've done is they've created a dramatic bifurcation, which we have between what God says through Moses and what God says through Jesus. And so he's not just a New Testament Christian. And so this is, we get this King James version of the commandment all the time, and it's wrong. The commandment is not thou shalt not kill. Killing is commanded by God all through the history of Israel, and people are punished, like Saul, for not killing, right? Murder is what you're prohibited from doing, and murder is when God doesn't command you to kill. It's when it's killing without a command of God. And Bonhoeffer saw that. And so the question was, and this is a lie, and he knew it was a question everyone would debate, and he answered it, but it's his conscience, his destiny. His answer was, God commanded this. And he was with others who heard the same command, his brother-in-law in particular, who was also hung. But yeah, that's how he would square it. So that's what I meant about he's complicated in that the voice that God spoke to Israel is as important to him as the voice God spoke through Jesus. And so that's also true of people like Calvin too. But it doesn't cancel out he doesn't use it to cancel all this out, which can happen, but he does it to complicate a simplistic Christian response. It's a really good question, though. It's a really good question. Yeah, Gay.
What I think everybody is trying to live into the expensive form of grace.
Right.
That is that we live in two worlds.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do both? How do you both love your enemy and love your friend who is being by you?
Right.
I mean, that is the sort of conundrum we face sometimes. But I don't want to say the lesser of two evils, but that somehow that is kind of compiled. I don't know. But when I read Bonhoeffer, how is struggle? He's struggling. How one to do that? How one should
Mm-hmm.
make that decision, even though you yourself will never.
Right. No, he didn't. No, thank you, Gay. And the pathos there in your statement is exactly him, right? This is not easy. But you're exactly right. The conundrum for him was the Jews, right? The Jews are being slaughtered by his government. And he was horrified that the churches were utterly silent on this. They spoke up, the confessing church spoke up at one point at Barmen in 1934, urging the government to reconsider its banning Jewish converts to Christianity being pastors in German Christian churches, right? That would be a real issue. That would be a beginning salvo, and then it stopped. That was it. And he's like, what about Kristallnacht? What about all the railroad cars carting people off to incineration? What's going on there? Can we just as Christians sit by and watch that happening? And does love of enemies, you see the conundrum that as a follower of Christ, you watch out for people who are suffering that way, right? And are in solidarity with them and love them. And on the other hand, as a follower of Christ, you're called to love your enemies. So this is not an easy, and I know Mennonites who anguish over this as well. You then just sit there, well, I'm going to love the enemies, putting people in railroad cars and carting them off to Auschwitz to incinerate them. Is that what I'm being called to do? And he's like, no, that can't be what Jesus meant. But it was especially the people of Israel that were being killed. That's what really bothered him. When I was at Barmen Wuppertal several years ago, my wife and I were there for a conference. And the church in Barmen is where the Barmen Declaration of 1934 was written by Karl Barth. And they had a thing called it was 5 articles and never mentioned the Jews and Christian relation to the Jews. That was Nostra Aetate later on, but not the Reformation churches. But the Barmen church had what they called the 6th article of the Barmen Declaration. And it's when Russian Jews emigrated to Barmen and they didn't have a synagogue, they built one for them on the grounds of the church in Barmen, where the Barmen Declaration was built. So the Jewish community in Barmen worships on the same property as the Christians. And then when anti-Semitic activity started breaking out, they wanted to put a fence around the synagogue. And the church said, no, you put a fence around the whole thing, around the whole compound. And so that was their way of trying to address, in Bonhoeffer's way, the void that was left by the church's failure to respond to what was happening to the Jews. But no, the anguish you expressed was especially real, and I think that's why he was part of the plot to assassinate Hitler. He couldn't sit by and watch the people of God who were Jewish be murdered, right? But it isn't an easy thing, right? God help you if you live in, that old curse. The Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, right? But it's messy because if you're a disciple in the world, those are the kinds of things that are going to confront you. Not all the time. The default would be this, but in his life, he would have been thrilled if he could have just lived his life this way, but he couldn't just live it this way. So I think that's really good to keep in mind that his own life was more complicated than this. The other thing that he points out, though, and we'll see this in a number of different people, is what's the point of loving your enemies, right? Uh-oh.
Battery.
No, is it something happened? No, there's no point in loving your enemies. Well, actually, that's what I was going to say. Let me see it. Oh, there it was. There, thank you, David. He has the magic touch. So he's our tech wizard. So thank you. We can often try to justify why would Jesus ask us to love our enemies? Well, it's to make them better people, right? So there's always a so what behind it. And Bonhoeffer points out, no, there really isn't. So he says, I love this. It's about 3 paragraphs on the bottom of the first page. Jesus speaks of enemies, that is, of those who will remain our enemies, unmoved by our love. Right? So he doesn't tell us to love our enemies so that they'll start loving us. He doesn't talk about loving our enemies so they'll become better people. He just says, love your enemies, even though they're probably going to hate you even more because you love them. Those who do not forgive us anything when we forgive them everything. Those who hate us when we love them. Those who insult us all the more we serve them. Right? So this is something that I think is very important to remember, that Jesus is not saying, if you love your enemy, they'll stop being your enemy. They might, probably won't. If you bless them, they'll stop cursing you. They might, probably won't, right? If you love them, they'll start persecuting you. They might, probably won't. And so you should expect it actually to get worse, not better. So this isn't a solution to the problem of hatred. This is discipleship in the face of hatred, knowing it's not going to make everything better. In fact, it might make everything worse. And then he quotes one of the Psalms, which shows, he's thinking about both sets of scripture. In return for my love, they accuse me, even while I make prayer for them. And I don't think he's wrong that Jesus probably had that line in mind. But love must not ask if it is being returned. We always ask that. Where's the sign that it worked? Where is the change in the relationship here? And there won't, according to Bonhoeffer, don't look for that. That's actually not love. If you're loving the enemy to change them, that's really not love. That's just another attempt at the usual human kind of love. But then he says, but love must not ask if it is being returned. Instead, it asks those who need it. It seeks those who need it. That's a really interesting turn. But who needs love more than they who live in hate without any love? Who therefore is more worthy of my love than my foe? How about that for a sentence, right? Who is more worthy of my love than my enemy? Because they need this love, even though they'll probably reject it and spurn it. Where is love praised more splendidly than amidst love's enemies? And so that, I think, that also could be a way of trying to say there is a so what, right? But it's not a so what in terms of a return you get. It's a so what in terms of why you would seek out the enemy in particular to love. And that's because the life dominated by hate is killing the person in whose life it's dominating, right? So there is possibly a hope that by loving them, they'll see something other than what they have in their heart. But I think it's really interesting that he thinks that the hatred creates a need that we need to address in love, not a need in us that it's going to be responded to when they start loving us in return. I really do think that's a major issue in this discussion in understanding love of enemies is what's the point? And is it so that they'll start loving us, or is it just because that's what we're supposed to do because they need it? And then he points out just how radically this extends. He says, this love knows no difference among diverse kinds of enemies, except that the more animosity the enemy has, the more of my love is required. And again, thinking in Nazi Germany, there's a lot of animosity, right? No matter whether it is political or religious enemy, they can all expect only undivided love from Jesus's followers. I am asked, how does this love act? Jesus says, bless them, do good to them, pray for them without condition, without regard for who they are. Right? And so he wants, it's another focus in this period of his life, which is the rest of his life, is that theology tends to talk a lot about God and write a lot about God, but it doesn't talk about doing things, right? When I was the director of the master's program at Notre Dame, the master's students in theology had seats in the stadium next to the business school, and so they competed in the MBAs, and so they competed with each other for slogans to put on T-shirts that they wear to the game. And so they had an election, a nomination of 3 different slogans for the T-shirt. And the one that won was Theology at Notre Dame, working out your salvation since the turn of the millennium. I thought that was a little too much, but the one that I wanted to win was Theology at Notre Dame. Don't just talk about God, write about God. Right. So we tend to focus very much on words, and teaching and writing and all that, but actually doing things. So Jesus, by saying, bless them, do good to them, pray for them in particular, is trying to get us out of just talking about this. This is something that has to manifest itself in action. And if you go through, we don't have enough time to look at all of the different sections, but I do encourage you to look through it because it's a very interesting description. He thinks that the most important of the things Jesus tells us to do, which is to bless and to do good, etc., is to pray. Is to pray. Yes.
How do we practice love in this polarized world today in our country?
By blessing those who curse. That's all. Have you done that? Have you blessed somebody who cursed you? Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, but that, I think there's more.
Okay.
You have to do more.
Okay.
So what more can we do? What would your answer be to what more can we do
To
our enemies today? We're very polarized in this country, and so what I'm asking is, whatever part you're on, what are you doing to help do something about that? To get understanding or something? What are we seeking to do? How are we following what Jesus asked us to do today when we're so polarized with people who we view as our enemies? There's something that came out just recently in a paper that said in this country, over 50% of us believe the other party is an enemy.
mm-hmm.
And so what are we doing about that? Is it just pray? I think it's got to be more.
No, I didn't say just pray. I said especially pray. Yeah, I would say what we've been trying to talk about for the last several weeks is my answer to your question. And I don't see, if you think the church in particular has outdone itself, has exhausted all possibilities in loving enemies and doing good for those who do evil, and in blessing those who curse, and in praying for those who oppress and persecute, then you're looking at the different community that I'm looking at. So we, as Christians, we have pledged discipleship, right? And he's not wrong about this. Do you promise to follow Christ in all of his teachings, et cetera? It's in our baptismal covenant, right? And this is what Jesus teaches us to do. So when we're in a polarized situation, can you imagine what it was like to be a Jew in Galilee under Roman occupation? There had already been one tax revolt in six of the Common Era by Judas the Galilean. So the Romans are very much aware of trouble in the Jewish community. So they lived in a highly tense time, right, under Roman rule. And this is the way he calls us to live. So that's the answer to the question. And if you've ever had a situation in which somebody views you as an enemy, and you pray for them, and you bless them, and you do good for them, and you just basically are ignoring the fact that they hate you. I mean, what you're basically doing, what Jesus is asking us to do, is treat the person the way we treat our most beloved companion, right? Ignore the enmity and bless them. Would you have any trouble blessing your children or your wife? No. Then why do you have trouble blessing your enemy? Right? So if you view the enemy not as an enemy, but as someone you love and do good for and pray for, is there anything you do for those you love that's different than that? Doing good, right? Blessing and praying for? Tell me what it is. And that's what you're supposed to do for your enemy, which means they're not an enemy. You're not supposed to view somebody as an enemy, right? So if we did that, there's no polarization. Christians can't participate in polarization because they don't believe in enemies, right? It doesn't mean there aren't people out trying to harm us. It doesn't mean that people aren't persecuting us. It doesn't mean people aren't cursing us if we follow Jesus. There's the other question. But when they do, then we're supposed to respond in this way. So I don't know any other answer than that. It's not sexy. It doesn't occur to us as natural people as the solution, but it is definitely discipleship. And that's the way Jesus lived, right? Up until the very end. So, I mean, for Pete's sake, he loves Peter after he denies him 3 times. He loves those who are crucifying him and prays for their forgiveness. There really isn't any, but he died. He died. He lost. His movement wasn't a victory march. Titus was a victory march. Titus enters Rome with the menorah and all of the trappings from the temple that he destroyed in 70. So if you want a winner, go with Titus. If you want a loser for love, go with Jesus. But he's also calling his disciples to lose. This isn't, and he lost. Bonhoeffer lost. He died at 39. Discipleship is not a way to extend your life with a long and happy, prosperous thing. It's when Christ calls us, he calls us to come and die, right? And so our life in this world doesn't mean the same thing that we think it does. So it's a really, I mean, your question's a really good one. And that's why Jesus is very frustrating to people. That's why the church has pretty much ignored this teaching for thousands of years, because it's really frustrating. And it means that you're willing your own defeat, right? You're willing your own defeat, but you're willing the victory of love. That's what you're willing, even though it might be defeated. Yes.
Also, Jesus stands up to power and confronts that which needs to be confronted, and Bonhoeffer did by helping in the assassination plot.
Right.
And so I wonder sometimes if what we can do now is stand up with those people who are responsible for containing president. If we can stand up for them when they do stand up to power and encourage that kind of courage. And as you say, they lose if they stand up to that power. But I think we all have to be willing. I, as a Christian, have to be willing to stand up to that and risk losing in order to take a stand. And that gives other people courage to stand up. And then more people are confronting the one who's leading, who's probably scared to death.
Yeah, I mean, so there are really two. Thank you for that. So there is, and Bonhoeffer is very popular now because of the resistance theme, right? We'll look at Martin Luther King Jr. Coming up. Gandhi will be in the background of that. So nonviolent resistance, in particular, actually Bonhoeffer would be somewhere in that mix in there. So yes, I mean, clearly he thinks that what Christians are called to do is resist, not to cooperate. And so the confessing church was resisting, right? By not cooperating with the Nazi regime and doing theology in accord and teaching pastors in accord with the German church way of doing things. The question is, though, and this gets more dodgy, and this goes back to Gay's point about being in the world. Are we resisting for the sake of Jesus, or are we resisting for the sake of the Constitution? And they're not the same thing. The United States has convinced us, and I think in a really interesting way, that if democracy falls, Christianity falls. That is absolutely not true. It's not true. So are we resisting so that the Constitution is observed? That's fine. But just be clear that's what we're doing. Or are we resisting out of love in a life of discipleship, which is a different thing? And you can see that, I mean, Bonhoeffer's life crosses that line, right? Because he would say our lives are in the world. But I think and we'll look at this in April, May, and June, I think that the way America came to be founded and the way religious ideas were influencing and being influenced by it, we really have convinced ourselves that if the United States democracy goes, which it might, I mean, there's nothing in history that's forever, then Christianity's gone. And that we have to resist the subverting of democracy because we're Christians. Well, there's nothing democratic about Christianity, and there's no essential connection between the two. Otherwise, how do you account for the billions of Christians living throughout the world where there's no democracy, right? Like Russia, right? Just to take China is another example, right? So I think that, but yes, I think resisting when you see others being wrong, for instance, to take Bonhoeffer's example of the Jews, you can't just sit by and watch the Jews be carted off and executed. And so there may be parallels in our day of similar forms of resistance, which I think then, yeah, I agree with you completely, but it has to do with for what are you resisting? That, I guess, is the question. If it's no kings, that's the democracy thing. I agree. We don't have a king, except we do have Jesus as king, right? So that changes things. But yeah, so it's a very interesting question. We use the word resistance a lot lately, well, since 2016, but it's just interesting to ask you, resisting what for the sake of what? That would be my.
We need to support the people who are resisting. If it's for the good, and hopefully it's for the good, that for God's will. But they also claim that's their.
Sure, that's what I was just gonna say.
If discern good, like Hitler or Bonhoeffer did, then we support, and other people also support.
But that's still, I agree, except resistance then starts to view people as enemies. Right? So I'm resisting you because you're doing wrong, and I'm doing the work of angels. And that's exactly what Jesus is trying to get us out of. Right? He's trying, so resist what? What are we resisting? I think we're resisting hating our enemies. That's what we're resisting. We're resisting seeing people as enemies whom we hate because they hate us. Right? It's so easy to fall back into that. It's just what we do. Right? So resistance is resisting the greatest resistance we have. You know, it said, Muhammad said, the hardest jihad is fighting your own failure to submit to Allah. Right? It's not fighting your enemy, it's fighting yourself. I would say the same thing about Jesus. If you really want to resist all the impulses that go against what Jesus is teaching us. That's what we need to resist. I would say, yes. Sylvia.
Bring it to a completely different level, which is more of the personal level and family. What if your enemy is the person who is abusing you in your family, say?
Yeah.
And then where is the line between this message and codependency, right? And I think that's a very complicated question, you know, because a lot of this advice can sound like codependent behavior, right? And so I think that if we could even tease that out at a personal level, it could open doors to understanding things at a bigger level.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's tough.
Oh yeah, no, this is one of the things that is very important part of understanding what he's telling us here is this empowering? Do you just keep forgiving the father who comes home and beats you every day after work, or is it the wife who's supposed to stay home and bless and pray for her husband who's beating her? And that's a question. I mean, that's a really good. We don't have time to go into that one, but yeah, this is really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in a very personal way. And are you meant to stay in situations that are going to kill you? Clearly Jesus tells his disciples, first of all, he's not interested in family and married life, right? And maybe for this very reason, because what he's asking people to do is really dangerous. And so if you have a family, you're endangering all of them, maybe against their will. But so that's the problem with Jesus, is he's not thinking in terms of families. But the other is that he tells his disciples when they're persecuted, flee. Right? Don't just hang around and get the you-know-what beat out of you. Flee. If you can't flee, then testify, and then, act in love toward your enemies, etc. But he's not telling people just to stand and take it. So I think so when they're persecuted, they flee from one town to another, right? And the Anabaptists said the same thing. What was Dirk Willems doing? He was running. He wasn't saying, oh, I love my enemy, therefore I'm going to submit to the thief catcher who's going to take me in and kill me. He ran. Right? And he had every right to run. Jesus gave him every right to run. So I would say that's my answer, is that if you're in an abusive situation, one way to save your life in it is to love and to forgive and to pray and then get out. But then continue to love and pray and forgive, right? Because the trap will be your hatred for the person who did that to you, right? So no, it's a really good question, but that would be my Jesus answer. But it's an excellent question, because this can be turned into an enabling kind of thing, but especially for people for whom it doesn't cost anything. Like if you're not being abused and you tell somebody to stay in an abusive relationship, no, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about you're being abused, right? So anyway, does that help? I mean, it's a huge issue. So, but that would be my answer. Well, we did it again. We've gone over. So thank you again, and we'll have a few weeks off, and then we'll pick up with Howard Thurman in April. So thank you.